Today's mindful moment. Imagine coming face to face with a shadow war, like literally seeing it with your own eyes. That's what happened to Alexander Vindman, a Ukrainian-American military expert. And he's telling the whole story in his new book, The Folly of Realism. And in this deep dive, we're going to dig into his book. We're going beyond the headlines. We're going to explore Vindman's firsthand account of the events that led to the current crisis in Ukraine. And trust me, his insights will challenge everything you thought you knew.
Yeah, what's really interesting here is that Vindman, he brings this really unique perspective because he served in both the Bush and the Obama administrations. He even had a posting in Moscow. So he's really able to dig deep into those historical narratives, the policy decisions that have shaped the current crisis.
So we're talking about a guy who was actually there in the room where it happened. That's pretty incredible.
Exactly. He takes us all the way back to the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Now, you might be thinking, what does a nuclear disaster have to do with the current war?
Yeah, that does seem like kind of a big jump.
But Vindman uses this event to illustrate a really important point about the power dynamics between Russia and Ukraine, even though they share a common origin story in Kievan Rus. Moscow always downplayed Ukraine's desire for a separate identity. And the Chernobyl disaster becomes this powerful example of how that lack of transparency, that lack of communication, even in the face of this shared crisis, foreshadowed the breakdown in trust that would ultimately lead to conflict.
So it's not just about the event itself, it's about what it reveals about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine.
Exactly. And to understand these deeper patterns, Vindman takes us to the formation of the UN Group in 1989.
Okay.
Now, this was a task force that was put together to manage the potential fallout of the Soviet collapse, particularly the nuclear threats.
Okay, that makes sense. Containing those loose nukes after the fall of a superpower? I mean, that had to be a top priority.
Absolutely. But Vindman argues that that singular focus on nuclear containment may have inadvertently empowered Russia. And it came at the expense of Ukraine's independence. It's like in their pursuit of stability, they kind of overlooked the aspirations of the Ukrainian people.
So you're saying they went for the short-term stability instead of long-term solutions that would have actually empowered Ukraine?
That's a key point. And this tension between stability and self-determination, you really see it when you look at President George H.W. Bush's Chicken Kyiv speech in 1991. This is where he cautioned against suicidal nationalism just days before Ukraine declared independence.
Wow, talk about bad timing. Here's Ukraine on the verge of declaring independence, and the U.S. president is essentially saying, don't rock the boat.
Yeah, it does seem to reflect a policy of prioritizing a stable Soviet Union over the self-determination of its republics, and Vindman argues that this had some long-lasting consequences.
It makes you wonder how things might have played out differently if the U.S. had been more assertive in their support of Ukraine's independence right from the start.
That's one of the questions that Vindman raises. And it leads us to another really crucial moment. The U.S. drive to denuclearize Ukraine in the 1990s.
Right, because after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was left with a massive nuclear arsenal.
And, on the surface, the U.S. push for denuclearization seems like a win for global security. But Vindman asks us to consider the unintended consequences. Did getting rid of those nukes create a security vacuum that Russia would later exploit?
So by giving up its nuclear weapons, Ukraine might have actually made itself more vulnerable to Russian aggression. That's kind of a shocking thought.
It is a complex issue, and Vindman doesn't offer any easy answers. From there, he guides us through the Clinton era, a period where there was some progress in engaging with Ukraine. But ultimately, that Russia-first approach persisted. The Clinton administration, they were really focused on promoting democracy in Russia. They believed that if Russia could successfully transition to a democracy, it would naturally benefit all of the former Soviet republics.
History has shown us that that's not necessarily the case.
Indeed. And then the rise of Putin further complicated things. His 2005 Duma speech, where he declared the collapse of the USSR a geopolitical catastrophe, that really signaled a turning point.
It was almost like a declaration of intent. Like Putin was laying out his vision for a resurgent Russia, and Ukraine was a key part of that puzzle.
Exactly. And this leads us to the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This was a pro-democracy movement that challenged Russia's influence, and it really solidified Putin's determination to regain control over what he saw as a wayward province.
So even as Ukraine was trying to move closer to the West, Putin was working to pull it back into Russia's sphere of influence.
And we see this pattern repeated again and again. Take the 2008 Russo-Georgia War, for example. Vindman argues that the West's weak response to Russia's actions in Georgia only emboldened Putin, and it set a precedent for future aggression.
It's like the West kept trying to appease Russia, hoping to avoid a larger conflict. But ultimately, that strategy failed.
And that brings us to 2014. the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the current war in Ukraine. And this is where Vindman's personal experience becomes really powerful. He actually witnessed Russian military convoys crossing into Ukraine. There was no denying Russian involvement.
Right, he had those firsthand accounts that contradicted the official Russian narrative. He was actually watching this shadow war unfold right in front of him.
And it's this experience that forms the basis of his argument, that the West's policy of realism, this idea of accommodating Russia to maintain short-term stability, ultimately backfired.
So what does Vindman propose instead? What's the alternative to this realism?
He calls it neo-idealism.
Neo-idealism. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating concept. Vindman argues that we need to shift away from this transactional short-term view of foreign policy, and we need to embrace a more principled stance, one that prioritizes democratic values and long-term goals, even if it means we have to accept some level of risk.
So it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Exactly. He believes that in trying to appease Russia, we've actually emboldened them. We've sent this message that we're not really willing to defend our values or support those who share them.
So how does this neo-idealism actually work in the real world? What would that look like?
Well, Vindman is pretty specific about his recommendations. He actually starts by criticizing both the Obama and the Trump administrations for how they handled the Ukraine crisis. He says Obama's response to the annexation of Crimea was too cautious, too focused on avoiding escalation.
So Obama kind of missed an opportunity to lay down the law and show Putin that there would be consequences for his actions.
That's Vindman's argument. He thinks that this hesitancy from the Obama administration just emboldened Putin, and it paved the way for the full-scale invasion in 2022.
What about Trump? I mean, Vindman had firsthand experience with Trump's approach to Ukraine, especially during that infamous phone call with Zelensky.
Right. The one that led to Trump's first impeachment. Vindman was one of the key witnesses who testified against Trump. He said that Trump trying to pressure Zelensky into investigating the Bidens was not only unethical, but it was really harmful to U.S. national security.
So from Vindman's perspective, Trump's America First approach was a total disaster, morally and strategically.
Absolutely. He says Trump's willingness to be friendly with dictators like Putin and his disregard for democratic norms sent a dangerous signal to the world. It was like giving Russia permission to pursue its aggressive goals in Ukraine.
It's interesting because Vindman is a Republican himself. He's not afraid to call out his own party when he thinks they're wrong.
And that's what makes his viewpoint so valuable. He's not coming at this from a purely partisan perspective. He's genuinely concerned about U.S. national security and the future of democracy, and he sees the mistakes of both parties as contributing to this crisis.
So Vindman is pretty tough on Obama and Trump. What about Biden? How does he see Biden's handling of the war so far?
He recognizes that Biden has rallied international support for Ukraine and that he's provided a lot of military aid. But he still sees some hesitation, like a reluctance to fully commit to ensuring a Ukrainian victory.
What does he think Biden should be doing differently?
He's especially critical of the administration's reluctance to give Ukraine certain weapons like long-range missiles, the kind that could really help them turn the tide of the war.
So basically he's saying Biden needs to be more willing to take risks, to push back harder against Russia.
Right. He argues that this fear of escalation is stopping the U.S. from doing what needs to be done to help Ukraine get a clear and decisive victory, a victory that would send a strong message to Russia and other potential aggressors.
But is that really realistic? Wouldn't giving Ukraine more advanced weapons risk escalating the conflict, maybe even dragging NATO into a direct war with Russia? That's a scary thought.
It's a valid concern, and Vindman gets that. But he argues that the potential consequences of letting Russia win in Ukraine are much worse than the risks of escalation. He thinks that a Russian victory wouldn't just be a humanitarian catastrophe. It would also encourage other authoritarian regimes, and it would undermine the whole rules-based international order.
So it's a gamble, but one that Vindman thinks we have to take.
He thinks the stakes are just too high to play it safe. He says we need to move past this idea of appeasement. And we need to embrace a more proactive foreign policy, one that's driven by our values and prioritizes defending democracy and the rule of law over just trying to maintain stability in the short term.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this neo-idealism into action?
Yeah.
What specific steps does Vindman propose we take?
Well, he lays out a pretty comprehensive strategy. It covers military assistance, economic sanctions, and diplomatic engagement. Let's start with the military side.
Sounds good. Ready to get into the specifics.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk military assistance. What does Vindman think the U.S. should be doing when it comes to arming Ukraine?
He's really clear about this. He says the U.S. needs to give Ukraine the weapons they need to win. And that means no more holding back, No more artificial limits. We're not just talking about defensive weapons, but offensive weapons too. The kind of firepower that can help them take back their land.
So tanks, fighter jets, long-range missiles, the whole shebang.
Exactly. Vindman thinks the U.S. needs to go all in. They need to show that they're fully committed to a Ukrainian victory. And that brings us to economic sanctions.
Right, because sanctions have been a big part of how the West has responded to Russia.
And Vindman sees them as a crucial way to squeeze the Russian economy, to limit their ability to keep fighting the war. He says we need to keep the sanctions we have in place and even make them stronger.
So cutting Russia off from the global financial system, hitting their energy exports, that sort of thing.
He believes that these economic measures, combined with strong military support for Ukraine, can really create the conditions for a negotiated solution,
Right.
one that favors Ukraine and discourages Russia from doing this again.
But haven't sanctions already hurt the Russian economy? How much more can they really do?
It's true, sanctions have had an impact, but Vindman says we need to be patient and persistent. The full effects of these kinds of economic measures take time to really kick in.
So it's a long game, but one that's worth playing.
Exactly. He believes that consistent, well-aimed sanctions can really weaken Russia's determination and eventually force them to rethink their actions.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about diplomacy? Is there any room for negotiation in Vindman's view? I mean, wars eventually end, and most of the time that happens through some kind of diplomatic process.
He's not against diplomacy, but he stresses that it has to come from a position of strength. You can't negotiate with a bully from a position of weakness, especially someone like Putin who sees any compromise as a weakness to be exploited.
So no more appeasement. No more trying to make Russia happy in hopes that they'll change their ways.
Vindman thinks those days are over. He says the West needs to be firm and clear in its demands. They need to make it very clear to Russia that there will be serious consequences for their aggression, and that any future talks have to be based on recognizing Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
That's a tough stance. Some people might say it's too idealistic, even naive. Can the U.S. and its allies really afford to completely alienate Russia, a country with a huge nuclear arsenal?
It's a legitimate concern, and Vindman addresses it. He knows the risks, but he argues that the alternative is much worse. If we keep appeasing Russia, if we let them call the shots, it will just embolden them even more. And that will lead to more instability and more conflict down the line.
So in Vindman's view, it's a choice between short-term pain and long-term gain.
You could say that he thinks the West has to be willing to make some sacrifices in the short term to create a safer and more democratic world in the long run. And this leads us to another interesting part of Vindman's analysis, his look at what's going on inside Ukraine.
Right, because it's easy to see Ukraine as one big unified thing. But the reality is much more complicated, isn't it?
Exactly. Vindman reminds us that Ukraine has always been this bridge between East and West, this crossroads of cultures and influences, and different parts of the country are often pulled in different directions.
And those divisions are something Russia's always tried to exploit, right?
Absolutely. Putin has used those divisions over and over again to create chaos and undermine Ukraine's stability and independence. But Vindman also points out how resilient Ukrainian society is. Their ability to come together when things get tough.
The Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan protests, the current resistance to the invasion. All of these show how strong the Ukrainian people are and how determined they are to control their own destiny.
Exactly. And Vindman suggests that in a tragic way, the war has actually sped up Ukraine's path toward becoming a truly independent and democratic nation. This shared struggle has really solidified their national identity, and it's strengthened their resolve to resist Russia's influence.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of tragedy, there can be hope and progress. So let's end with this. If Vindman could look into the future, what does he see happening in Ukraine, in Russia, in the world?
Vindman thinks that the outcome of the war in Ukraine will have a huge impact on the future of Europe and the world. He sees it as this really critical moment, a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. If Russia wins, it will send a very dangerous message to other authoritarian regimes. It will weaken the international order that's kept things relatively peaceful and stable for decades.
So this could be a real turning point in history. We could be on the edge of a new era of instability and conflict.
But he also believes that a Ukrainian victory, a decisive defeat of Russia's aggression, could have the opposite effect. It could inspire democratic movements all over the world. It could strengthen the global commitment to democracy and human rights. And it could usher in a new era of cooperation and stability.
So the stakes couldn't be higher.
That's exactly what Vindman is saying. What happens in Ukraine isn't just about one country. It's about the future of democracy itself.
Vindman's book, The Folly of Realism, is a powerful and important wake-up call. It challenges us to rethink how we approach foreign policy and to consider a bolder, more principled way of dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. It's definitely a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the forces that are shaping our world. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, you can get Alexander Vindman's book through the link in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe and share this deep dive with anyone who wants to understand what's happening in the world.